Hey everybody, welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be talking about Black Mirrors associated with the colonial period as well as traveling artifacts, so should be interesting. Let's get started. Now, I started on this subject by coming across some articles talking about the Aztec origins of John Dee's famous mirror and how there's a lot of mystery behind it, because when you look at some of these articles, it appears that there were no records of these mirrors' origin, but after some more testing, they have indeed connected these obsidian discs, basically, which are being used as black mirrors. They have associated them with the Aztec Empire and the early colonial period. So I found that really interesting because I'm used to hearing about the use of obsidian associated with earlier time periods, but not so much the colonial period. So I wanted to keep looking into that. Getting back to the black mirrors and the colonial period, turns out in Mexico, there are a lot of these really interesting looking crosses, these stone crosses, also referred to as atrial crosses. And some of them actually have these black mirrors inset on some of the crosses. But I believe a lot of them are now gone, but this is an example of one that still has the obsidian. And I just thought that was really unusual look to this cross and the use of these black mirrors. So yeah, just something I came across, and this is just a typical layout of one of these 16th century convents, monasteries, churches. And when I was looking at these atrial crosses, I just came across this article just talking about how the number of monasteries, convents, churches, and chapels built in Mexico in the late 1500s and 1600s remains a historically astonishing achievement. Yeah, I would agree. It's probably because a lot of these things were built at an earlier point, in my opinion. But these are just some more of the crosses that are missing the obsidian. And a lot of the bases of these crosses have some really unique designs, like skull and bones. And going back to that one cross that did have the obsidian disc, the base of that one also a skull and bones, and what we're told are the 5 wounds of Christ, and another cross, skull and bones. So a lot going on with these crosses. But even if you go to North America and we look in California and some of the missions, the 21 missions associated with California, there has been obsidian found associated with some of these missions, like this one, Santa Clara. And yeah, obsidian artifacts have been recovered from this mission. And what I found interesting about this is that, as mentioned, a lot of study has been done with regards to obsidian used in prehistoric contexts, but research on its acquisition and use by indigenous populations during colonial periods, it's relatively limited. So I think there's a lot more going on during the colonial period than we're being told. And that mission that we just looked at was to the south of San Francisco, but if you go to the north of San Francisco, there was this Russian outpost, Fort Ross, and that is considered the southernmost outpost of the Russian Empire in colonial America, and it was established by the Russian American Company in 1812. Again, this is all just the official history, but they've also found obsidian here as well. They have found obsidian tool fragments as well as, I believe, obsidian arrowheads at this Fort Ross. So a lot of history that has maybe being ignored and just not looked into the use of obsidian with the indigenous peoples and populations relative to the colonial period. It seems like there's a lot more extensive trade networks than we're led to believe, especially on the west coast of the United States. But what else I thought was pretty unique with regards to some of the archaeological finds at Fort Ross, they have found Siberian coins, which isn't too unusual. But they've even found coins, once again at Fort Ross. They've also found these coins from Moldavia and Wallachia. So we're talking Eastern Europe, and these regions were largely absorbed by Romania in the 1800s. But you know how great of a distance that is in the 17 and 1800s. Again, travel according to what we're told, is extremely limited. You're looking at months of travel time, according to the history we're given prior to like 1860. So just wild, some of the artifacts showing up on the west coast here of North America and the United States. And what else they found at Fort Ross, and I've talked about this in a previous video, they found things like these phoenix buttons, and they were supposedly manufactured for use on, I believe, military uniforms for the Haitian army, but they never quite fulfilled that purpose, so they were being traded and they ended up on the west coast. But they're also at this Russian fort, and they're also found in Alaska, and they're also found in Hawaii at this Russian fort, Fort Elizabeth. And I just wanted to point out that these artifacts are traveling great distances, and I think that's got to do with this lost history, and we're being given a reimagined colonial period, in my opinion. But again, star forts, star cities, I think there was some destructive event that affected a lot of these places. And these phoenix buttons can also be found at all these mission sites, once again, in California. So a lot of artifacts traveling great distances. And the last thing I want to touch on, speaking of the missions, there's another mission, San Fernando in California, and it's considered the 17th of the 21 Spanish missions established. But there's this mysterious Russian Alaskan bell associated with this mission. And there's a lot of questions as to how did this bell that's coming from Alaska even end up in this mission. And as you kind of look into the story, it turns out that they rediscovered this bell in like the 1920s, and it was unearthed in an orange grove near the mission. Now, they say it was intentionally buried to hide it from people looting, but which is possible. But I just thought that was an interesting point. And another interesting point is they actually deciphered what was written on the bell, and it reads 1796. In the month of January, this bell was cast on the island of Kodiak. So Kodiak Island, so we're way up here. And again, this location, we're going all the way down off screen here. But what I found interesting about this decipherment, they're mentioning January 1796, this bell was cast. Well, the first Russian Orthodox mission to that island, Kodiak Island, wasn't even established until 1794, when you had 10 monks along with 2 other people from nearby monasteries. They arrived at the end of 1794. That marked the beginning of any significant Russian presence in missionary work. So 16 months later, they're already casting bells. And I think this bell weighed about 100 pounds, so it's not impossible, but they literally just showed up at the end of 1794. And they probably didn't even have a proper parish. You know, they're literally in the 1790s, you're showing up to Kodiak Island with 12 people, and you have to establish yourself. But they're cranking out this bell, and somehow this bell ends up in California. People aren't quite sure how that happened, and then it's buried in an orange grove. So just a lot of interesting circumstances surrounding this bell. And I just wanted to mention it, speaking of traveling artifacts, and I wanted to touch on the use of obsidian in the colonial period, because I think there's some lost history there that could be delved into a bit more. But just things I've come across that I wanted to share with you guys. I think that's about all I got for you for today. I do want to give a big shout out to my channel members. Thank you for all your help and support. Greatly appreciated. As well as my patrons. Thank you for all your help and support. It's also greatly appreciated. So with that being said, until next time, take care. Bye.